You probably grew up with the idea that something like a gold confiscation could never happen again in the United States. It feels like one of those strange stories from the distant past, like black and white photographs and bread lines and men in hats, standing outside closed banks. That was your grandfather's world, not yours. Today you pay with plastic cards and phone apps. Gold feels like a hobby, not the center of the financial system. But buried inside the law and inside the history of the dollar is a very real lesson. Governments do not always fix a debt crisis by cutting spending or raising normal taxes. Sometimes they change the rules of money itself. They do not call it theft. They call it stability. They call it recovery. On paper, it even looks clean. The numbers on the government balance sheet improve. But the cost is pushed onto savers who thought they were safe. To understand why people are worried again, and why some analysts think a future administration under Trump could be tempted to use something like a gold revaluation, you have to go back to the year 1933 and look carefully at what actually happened. Not the simple story in school books, but the mechanical steps, the prices, and the laws that made it possible. In early 1933, the United States was in the middle of the Great Depression. Banks were failing. People were scared and were pulling cash and gold out of the system. At that time, the dollar was tied to gold by law. 1 ounce of gold was fixed at $20.67. That fixed price was not just a random number. It was the anchor for the whole monetary system. If you wanted more dollars in circulation, you needed more gold to back them at that rate. If the government tried to print too many dollars without enough gold, the link would break. By the start of 1933, that fixed price had become a trap. The United States was carrying heavy debts, and the economy was shrinking. Tax receipts were falling. The government needed to spend more to stop the collapse, but the gold standard was like a hard wall in front of it. At $20.67 per ounce, there was simply not enough gold at that official price to support the amount of money they wanted to create. If they kept the promise, the system would keep freezing. If they broke the promise, they would have to admit that the dollar was worth less. So President Franklin Roosevelt chose a third path, which sounded technical but had a very real effect on normal people. In April 1933, he signed Executive Order 6102. That order did not send soldiers house to house to rip rings off people's fingers. It did something more subtle. It made it illegal to hoard most forms of gold coin, bullion and gold certificates, and required people to deliver their gold to the banking system in exchange for dollars at the official price. In simple terms, the government said, bring your gold to the bank, and we will pay you $20.67 per ounce. And if you keep too much of it, you could face fines or even jail. There were some exceptions for small amounts, for jewelry, and for industrial uses. But for the core monetary gold that people held as savings, the message was very clear. You were expected to hand it over. Many people complied because they were scared, because they trusted the government, or because they felt they had no real choice. Some people did hide their gold and never turned it in. But for the financial system as a whole, the main effect was that gold flowed from citizens to the government, and then into the central bank's control. That was step one. Step two came soon after. In 1934, Congress passed the Gold Reserve Act. This law changed the official price of gold from $20.67 per ounce to $35 per ounce. On the surface, this looked like good news for gold, because the price per ounce was higher. But if you had already turned in your gold at the old price, that gain did not go to you. It went to the government. Think of it this way. Imagine you were forced to sell your house to the state for $200,000. A year later, the state decides that for accounting purposes, it will now value that same house at $350,000. On the government's books, it suddenly looks richer. The government's assets jumped. But you only ever saw $200,000. The extra $150,000 that appeared on paper belongs to the state, not to you. That is what happened with gold. The government collected gold at the low official price. Then it raised the official price for its own reserves. The dollar was devalued, which helped the government inflate away part of its debt and gave it more room to create money. The profit from that change did not go to households. It helped fund programs and stabilize the banking system. From the government's point of view, it was a clever way to fix a broken balance sheet. From the saver's point of view, it was a forced transfer of purchasing power. This is important for today, because it shows that a gold confiscation, in the modern sense, does not always mean someone kicks down your door and takes your coins. It can happen through price and law. The metal moves into official hands. The price is reset. The government's position improves. The private saver is left with a weaker currency and no claim on the upside. Now fast forward to the present. The numbers have changed. The structure of the financial system has changed. But the basic tension is still there. The United States again sits on top of a mountain of debt. The gross national debt has passed $37 trillion and then $38 trillion in 2025, and it is still climbing. The interest payments alone have grown so much that they are larger than what the government spends each year on many major programs, and in recent years they have even rivaled or passed defense spending. For most people, these numbers are so large that they stop feeling real. 1,000, 1,000,000, 1,000,000,000, 1,000,000,000,000. It all blends together. One way to put it in human terms is this. In recent years, the debt has been climbing by around $1 trillion in a matter of months. That is like adding another entire giant federal program again and again without ever really paying down the last ones. The bill for past promises keeps getting heavier. At the same time, tax increases are politically unpopular and deep spending cuts are also unpopular. Every side of the political spectrum has programs it wants to protect. So leaders look for other tools. They look for ways to reduce the real burden of the debt without calling it default. That is where inflation, devaluation, and financial engineering come in. In 2025, President Trump signed a huge tax and spending package called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. It extended earlier tax cuts, added new tax breaks, and increased spending in areas like defense and border security. Independent budget analysts estimate that over 10 years, this law alone will add several $1 trillion to the national debt, on top of the trillions that were already there. The law also raised the debt ceiling by another $5 trillion, which gave the Treasury more room to borrow. This explains why some people look at the situation and feel a chill that reminds them of 1933. Back then, new spending programs and emergency efforts ran into the hard limit of the gold standard. Today, new tax cuts and spending promises run into the hard limit of market trust. At some point, investors can start to question whether the United States can keep rolling its debt at low interest rates forever. When that trust wobbles, bond yields rise. When yields rise too far, the interest bill explodes even more. When a country reaches that point, its leaders face ugly choices. One option is a true hard default, where the government tells bondholders it will not pay them in full or on time. In a country like the United States, whose debt sits at the center of the world's financial system, that kind of event would be like a heart attack. Banks hold treasuries as core assets. Money market funds treat them as ultra-safe. A direct default would freeze credit, destroy savings, and trigger a global crisis. Because of this, most mainstream economists and politicians see open default as a last resort that they are desperate to avoid. The other option is softer and more complicated. The government keeps paying its bonds in nominal terms, but it takes actions that reduce the real value of those payments. Inflation is one tool. If prices of goods and services rise faster than your bond coupons, then the creditor is still getting dollars, but those dollars buy less. Over many years, this can quietly erase a big part of the debt. Another tool is to change the rules of how money is backed, valued, or taxed. That is where gold laws from 1933 and modern ideas about reserves re-enter the picture. It is important to be clear about what is known and what is not. Today, there is no official public plan by the U.S. government to confiscate private gold or to revalue it to a specific price, such as $20,000 per ounce. When people talk about those numbers, they are working through scenarios, equations, and stress tests. They are asking, if the government wanted to use its official gold to strengthen its balance sheet, what price would make the math work? They are not reading from a published timetable. At the same time, it is also true that many of the legal tools used in the 1930s have modern cousins. The Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, which was used and amended during the Depression, gave the president very broad authority over gold and foreign exchange in times of war and emergency. Later laws, such as the Emergency Banking Act and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, also give presidents strong control over financial flows when they declare a national emergency related to security or foreign threats. These powers have been used many times in modern history, for example, to freeze assets of foreign governments, sanction certain countries, or restrict some kinds of transactions. Because of this, Some legal scholars and investors worry that in a future crisis, a president could use emergency powers in a new way. Instead of sending officers to physically seize gold, they could change the tax treatment of gains. They could limit certain types of transactions. They could punish or discourage the use of assets that compete with the dollar. They could justify it in the name of national security, financial stability, or economic warfare with rival nations. This is the real core of the fear. Not that every coin will be grabbed from every safe, but that the rules of the game can change quickly when the system is under stress. Your asset might stay in your hand, but its legal and financial environment can shift overnight. History shows that this has happened before. Law shows that modern presidents still have powerful tools. The rising debt shows that the pressure to find creative solutions is growing. What we do not know is exactly how or when those tools might be used. We do not know what choices future leaders, including Trump if he is in office, will actually make. We do know that when governments face very large debts, they tend to look for paths that spread the pain quietly over savers rather than loudly over voters. That is why many people are now looking back to 1933, studying the fine print, and asking hard questions about the next chapter. If you really want to understand why people still worry about government power over money, you have to look at the way emergencies are written into the law. In normal times, the rules feel stable. You can move your money, buy assets, sell assets, and pay your bills without thinking about it. But hidden in the legal code are special doors that only open when a president declares an emergency. Once that word is used, a very different rulebook comes out of the drawer. Back in 1933, the key law was the trading. With the Enemy Act of 1917, it started as a wartime law that gave the president the power to control foreign exchange and gold. During World War I, later it was extended and used in the Great Depression. That is one reason Roosevelt could tell people to bring in their gold, and why he could control the movement of gold and foreign currencies. At that time, gold was still the center of the system. If the government could control gold, it could control the money. Since then, some parts of that law have changed or been limited, and new laws have taken its place. One of the most important modern ones is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, usually called EPE. That law lets the president declare a national emergency that is tied to an external threat. When that happens, the president gains broad authority to regulate or block certain financial transactions and to freeze assets. In practice, this has often been used to sanction foreign governments, criminal organizations, or individuals linked to terrorism. Accounts get frozen, banks are told to block transfers, and certain trades become illegal. On paper, these powers are aimed at foreign threats. That is why you often see them in the news in the context of sanctions. But when people look at the language, they notice something else. The definition of threats can be wide. Modern leaders and security officials talk not only about tanks and missiles, but about cyber attacks, energy supplies, supply chains, and currency conflicts. In other words, the idea of what counts as a national security threat has expanded far beyond classic war. This is where the conversation starts to touch gold, the dollar, and alternative assets again. If a president believes that the stability of the United States financial system is under serious attack, and that this attack is linked in some way to foreign actors or to capital flows, then emergency powers can be invoked. When that happens, controls can be placed on how money moves, how certain assets are traded, and how banks treat some positions. The tools exist. How far a president would be willing to go is a political question, but the doors are there in the legal code. At the same time, the global environment is changing. Countries like China and Russia have said in public that they want to reduce their dependence on the dollar. Several countries in the BRICS group have talked about settling trade in their own currencies or exploring new payment systems. Some central banks have been quietly increasing their gold reserves. None of this means that the dollar is about to vanish. It is still the dominant reserve currency and is used in a large share of global trade. But the trend has made Washington more sensitive to anything that could weaken confidence in its debt or its currency. From that point of view, assets like gold and Bitcoin look different, depending on where you sit. For an individual saver, they can feel like a shield against inflation and political risk. For a finance ministry that is trying to keep its bond market stable and its currency strong, they can sometimes look like rivals or pressure points. When too many people run for the exits at once, leaving government bonds for alternative stores of value, yields can spike and the debt burden can become even heavier. does not mean the government wants to ban everything it does not like. Outright bans tend to backfire and drive activity underground. Instead, modern states usually prefer softer tools. They regulate, they tax, they shape incentives, and they watch. They push people towards certain channels and away from others. They rarely need to put a lock on every door if they can design the hallway itself. Now think about how money actually moves today. In 1933, most transactions happened in cash and through local banks. Records were on paper. To enforce a ban or a restriction, the government had to lean heavily on banks and on the honesty or fear of citizens. In the 21st century, most payments are digital. Salaries go straight into accounts. Bills are paid online. Brokerage accounts sit on servers. Crypto assets move across transparent public blockchains. All of this creates a map of wealth that is far more detailed than anything Roosevelt's officials had. This is why many people are nervous when they hear talk about central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. A CBDC is a type of digital money issued directly by a central bank. It is not just an online version of today's bank deposits. In theory, a CBDC can be programmed. That means it can have rules attached to it by design. For example, in some pilot projects in other countries, central banks have tested features, like time limits on spending or restrictions on certain categories of purchases. The argument from the official side is that this can help with targeted support, anti-fraud measures, and faster payments. The fear from critics is that the same tools could be used to control behavior or to enforce financial penalties in a very direct way. If every unit of money exists as an entry in a central ledger, and if every wallet is tied to a verified identity, then taxes, fines, and restrictions can be applied in real time. The system would not have to wait for you to file a return or for a bank to process a report. Code could check and act at the moment of each transaction. Imagine a future where the United States faces yet another debt scare. Bond yields spike. Investors start to question whether the Treasury can keep borrowing at a reasonable cost. Panic headlines talk about downgrades and sell-offs. In response, the president steps in front of the cameras and declares a national economic emergency. A package is announced. It includes a new form of digital dollar that the government says will modernize the payment system and help deliver relief more quickly. At the same time, it introduces a special tax on what lawmakers describe as extraordinary gains on certain assets during the crisis. In that kind of scenario, you do not need agents carrying out sacks of gold from private homes. If the special tax applies at the moment of sale, and if every major dealer, bank, and payment processor is plugged into the central system, then the tax can be taken before the seller ever sees the full proceeds. If the new digital dollar is required for large transactions or for paying taxes and debts, then anyone who wants to turn their asset into usable money has to pass through the same gate. This sounds extreme when described in the abstract, but the basic idea is not new. In the past, the United States has used special tax rates on unexpected profits in certain industries. One example is the windfall profit tax on oil companies in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Lawmakers argued that sudden jumps in oil prices, driven by global tensions and supply shocks, were giving producers profits that went far beyond normal expectations. They did not seize the oil fields. Instead, they created a system where earnings above a set base level were taxed at higher rates. Apply that frame to gold or other assets in a debt crisis. If the price of gold or Bitcoin were to shoot up while the dollar was under stress, it would be easy for politicians to paint those gains as unearned or as harmful to the rest of the country. They could argue that such profits came not from productive work but from fear and instability. A special levy on those gains could then be sold to the public as a way to make speculators help pay for recovery. Many voters might support that message, especially if they themselves do not own much of those assets. With a CBDC and strict reporting rules, collecting such a levy would be simple. The system would know the official base price. It would know your cost basis if the law required dealers and exchanges to report it. When you sell, the smart contract or the central ledger could send the agreed share to the tax authority and the rest to your account. There is no need for long forms or audits if the code performs the calculation automatically. For people who prefer privacy, there is always the thought of staying outside the official net. Someone might think, I will keep my coins or my bars hidden. I will trade directly with trusted people. I will avoid regulated platforms. In some small cases, that would still be possible. Human beings have always found ways to trade outside the official system. But the problem grows as soon as you want to connect with the wider economy. At some point, you need to pay for food, housing, energy, healthcare, and services that sit firmly inside the regulated world. If the new digital dollar becomes the main way to pay taxes and pay large bills, then any wealth that cannot be converted into it becomes less useful. You might hold metal or tokens or foreign currency, but if the shops, lenders, and agencies you deal with only accept money that has passed through the controlled gateways, then your options are limited. The pressure is slow but strong. Over time, more and more people choose to comply simply because it is easier. This is why location and legal jurisdiction matter so much in the kind of strategy that cautious investors talk about. It is not only about what you own, but also about where it is held and what laws apply to it. Some countries have stronger traditions of protecting property from foreign claims. Some have laws that limit how far they will go in enforcing another nation's emergency decrees. Others cooperate closely and will freeze or hand over assets as soon as they are asked. For example, if all your wealth is in accounts, vaults, and properties inside the United States, then it sits under the full reach of U.S. law. A single executive order, combined with cooperation from banks and payment companies, can affect nearly everything you own. That does not mean it will happen, but the possibility exists. If some of your holdings are in another country with different rules, then any U.S. action has to pass through an extra layer of law and diplomacy. Sometimes it can, sometimes it cannot, depending on treaties and local policy. In the past, wealthy families used secret numbered accounts to hide their money. Today that image is outdated. Many traditional secrecy havens have signed agreements to report foreign accounts to tax authorities. Open evasion is harder and riskier than it used to be. Modern asset protection focuses less on hiding and more on legal structure. It uses trusts, companies, and storage arrangements that follow the law but are placed in jurisdictions where foreign orders are not automatically obeyed. For an ordinary saver, this can sound distant and complicated, but the principle is simple. If you are worried about a future in which a debt-heavy government might target certain assets, there are two main levers you can pull. You can think about what you own, you can think about where you own it. Both choices involve trade-offs, costs, and legal obligations. They are not magic solutions. They are simply ways to reduce the number of paths by which one country can reach into your savings. All of this brings us back to the central question. Could something like the 1933 gold episode happen again under a modern president, including Trump? The honest answer is that no one can say for sure. We can say that the exact same conditions do not exist. The United States is off the classic gold standard. The dollar floats. Financial markets are global and complex. We can also say that some of the pressures are similar. There is still a large debt, and there is still a strong temptation to use quiet forms of devaluation to relieve that burden. We can say that the tools have changed. Instead of mailed orders and bank posters, we have emergency acts, modern regulations, digital reporting, and the potential of a programmable currency. Instead of simple gold coins in millions of pockets, we have a mix of bank money, fund shares, crypto tokens, and claims on physical metal stored in vaults. Instead of a single executive order telling people to hand over coins, there could be complicated combinations of taxes, transaction rules, reporting requirements, and wallet controls. What has not changed is the basic conflict between a state that wants flexibility and a saver who wants certainty. When a system is under stress, each side looks for safety in a different place. The state looks to its legal powers and its control over the system. The saver looks to scarce assets, foreign shelter, or private arrangements. History shows that in critical moments, the state is willing to use the tools it gave itself. That does not mean every worst-case scenario will come true. It does mean that ignoring those tools is unwise. In the end, this is not a story about guaranteed doom. It is a story about pressure and choice. A government under financial strain has a menu of options, some fair, some heavy-handed. A citizen has a menu too, though it is smaller. Learn the history. Understand the laws. Pay attention to how technology changes the way money works. Accept that there is no perfect hiding place, only better and worse positions. The more clearly you see the moving parts, the less surprised you will be if the rules of the game begin to shift. To truly understand why gold often appears at the center of every major debt crisis, you have to understand one hidden part of the U.S. government's accounting system. It is something most people have never heard of, and yet it quietly sits at the heart of how the dollar was once tied to gold, and how it could be tied again in a different way. This part of the system is called the gold certificate account. Today, the United States officially holds a little over 261 million ounces of gold. Most people assume that this gold is valued on government books at the same market price they see on the news each day. But that is not how it works. By law, the U.S. Treasury still values its gold at a fixed official price of about $42 per ounce. That price was set decades ago. It has never been updated to reflect the real market value. Because of this accounting rule, all of the gold held by the United States appears on official balance sheets as being worth only around $11 billion. Anyone who knows the real gold price immediately sees how strange that number is. At market prices, that same gold would be worth hundreds of billions more. Yet on the books, it remains frozen at a price from another era. This creates a strange situation. The government sits on a massive store of value but officially treats it as a small asset. At the same time, it issues trillions of dollars in debt. Those two facts sit side by side in the accounting system, but they are not allowed to touch. Here is where the mechanism becomes important. The Federal Reserve Act allows the Treasury to issue gold certificates to the Federal Reserve. These certificates represent the value of the gold at the official price. The Fed holds the paper certificates. The Treasury holds the physical metal. In return for these certificates, the Fed credits the Treasury's account with dollars. This is how the system worked under the gold standard and how the framework still exists today, even though the dollar is no longer officially backed by gold. If the official gold price were ever raised by law, even on paper only, the value of the gold certificate account would jump instantly. The Treasury could then issue new certificates at the higher value. The Federal Reserve would be required to accept them. In return, the Treasury's cash balance would rise without issuing new bonds and without collecting new taxes. No interest would be owed on that money because it would not be borrowed. It would be created through revaluation. This is why some analysts say gold is still quietly sitting under the dollar as a shadow tool. Not as an everyday backing like it once was, but as an emergency lever. The legal framework for that lever still exists. What is missing is the political will to pull it. Now think about today's numbers. The U.S. monetary base, meaning physical cash plus bank reserves at the Federal Reserve, has grown into the trillions of dollars. This base money acts as the foundation for the whole banking system. When fear hits the system, people run not from stocks but from banks. They want access to deposits and cash. If the base money supply is seen as unstable, trust can break very fast. Some people look at this base money number and then look at the official gold holdings and ask a simple math question. If the government wanted to fully cover the monetary base with its gold at market prices, what price per ounce would be needed? When you divide the total base money by the total ounces of U.S. gold, you get a price that is far higher than today's gold price. Depending on the exact numbers used, the result often lands somewhere in the range of many thousands of dollars per ounce. This is where numbers like $15,000 or $20,000 per ounce enter the discussion. These are not magic predictions. They come from dividing two very large numbers and seeing what price would make the spreadsheet balance. It is not a promise. It is a stress test. It answers the question, if the government ever tried to use gold to strengthen confidence in the dollar again, what level would be required? Whether such a move ever happens is unknown. It would be a massive policy decision with global consequences. Other countries would react. Markets would react. Laws would likely change. It would not be a quiet weekend adjustment like in the past. But the math itself explains why the idea keeps coming back in times of heavy debt. At the same time, a second major change has been happening quietly in global banking. This change is known as the Basel reforms. These are international rules that guide how banks measure risk and how much capital they must hold. For many years, gold was treated as a risky asset in bank balance sheets. Banks that held gold had to set aside extra capital as protection against price changes. This made gold unattractive for many large institutions. Under newer Basel rules, physical allocated gold can now be treated as a top-tier asset for some regulatory purposes. This means that under certain conditions, it can be counted alongside cash and government bonds as high-quality collateral. This change does not mean gold is now the official world currency. But it does mean that in a crisis, banks can lean on gold more easily than before without being punished by regulators. From one point of view, this is logical. Gold has no default risk. It is not someone else's promise to pay. From another point of view, it is also telling. The global banking system has spent years preparing rules that quietly restore gold's status as a stability asset. This was done long before the current debt tensions reached today's level. Many people never noticed this shift because it was buried in technical language that only bankers and lawyers read. But it changes how gold behaves in a crisis. If gold rises sharply in price and is treated as strong collateral, the banks that hold it appear healthier on paper, their capital ratios improve, their balance sheets look stronger. This can soften the shock of a broader financial storm. This leads some analysts to a troubling conclusion. They argue that gold is being positioned not only as a hedge for private investors, but as a shock absorber for the banking system itself. If that is true, then a future gold revaluation would not mainly be about helping savers. It would be about stabilizing institutions. This brings us to another risk that ordinary investors often overlook. Many people think they own gold because they bought shares in an exchange-traded fund or hold a futures contract. On a screen, it looks just like ownership. A ticker symbol moves up and down. Your account balance changes with the gold price. But legally, this is not the same as holding a bar or coin in your own custody. Most paper gold products work on a fractional reserve basis. This means that for every ounce of physical gold held in a vault, many more ounces are represented by promises on paper. As long as most people only trade the promises and do not ask for physical delivery, the system works. But if too many people demand physical gold at once, the system strains. There simply is not enough metal to satisfy every claim at the same time. In normal markets, that risk is small because most traders never want to touch a real bar. They only want price exposure. But in a true financial panic, psychology changes. When trust in paper claims falls, the desire for physical possession rises. This is when paper markets can break. If a major revaluation or a severe shortage were ever to occur, exchanges have legal clauses that allow them to settle contracts instead of metal. This is known as forced settlement. It means that even if the quoted gold price on some markets jumps, you might be paid out in dollars based on a prior reference price if physical delivery is deemed impossible. At that moment, you would no longer be exposed to gold at all. You would be back in cash at exactly the wrong time. This is not a conspiracy theory, it is written into the contracts. It has happened in smaller ways in past commodity squeezes. The rule exists to protect the functioning of the exchange, not the long-term strategy of individual investors. When survival of the system is at stake, individual paper holders come second. Now add another layer to this picture. Over the last decade, digital assets like Bitcoin have grown from a hobby of programmers into a market worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Some people see Bitcoin as digital gold. Others see it as a speculative risk asset. Governments see it mainly as a new payment system that grew outside traditional banking. For years, regulators struggled to decide what to do with it. Some ignored it. Some tried to ban it. Some tried to regulate it. Today, most large economies have moved toward formal regulation instead of outright prohibition. They require identity checks at exchanges. They require transaction reports. They tax gains. This does not kill the market. It pulls it into a regulated channel. For many users, this felt like a victory. It meant that Bitcoin and other digital assets were now recognized by the system. Banks began to offer custody services. Large funds began to allocate small portions of capital. Headlines talked about adoption and maturity. Yet this same process also made the network far more visible to the state. When crypto activity is driven through licensed exchanges, linked to real names, and connected to bank accounts, it becomes just another traceable part of the financial system. The old dream of total privacy fades. The door to future controls quietly opens. If, at some point, a central bank digital currency is introduced alongside these regulated crypto gateways, the authorities gain a powerful choke point. They can decide which addresses can connect to the banking system and which cannot. They do not need to shut down the blockchain itself. They only need to control the bridges between the chain and everyday money. In calm times, this does not matter. People move in and out freely. In a crisis, it could become critical. If special taxes, restrictions, or reporting rules are imposed during an emergency, they would likely be enforced at those bridges. Dealers, exchanges, and payment processors would be the gatekeepers. This is why many emergency finance plans focus not on banning assets, but on capturing the exits. You are free to hold what you like. The pressure begins when you try to convert, spend, or report it. That pressure increases when the law ties compliance to access to basic economic life. All of these tools point in one direction. They show that a modern state does not need visible confiscation to reshape who bears the cost of a crisis. Subtle control over accounting, taxation, and settlement can be just as effective. This does not mean that such a sweeping plan is certain to happen. It means only that the technical and legal capacity exists. History shows that capacity is often used when stress becomes severe enough. The deeper the debt hole becomes, the more attractive these hidden levers look to policymakers. What keeps many people calm is the belief that political limits will always stop extreme measures. Voters would never allow it. Courts would block it. Markets would revolt. Sometimes this faith is justified. Sometimes it fails. In 1933, many Americans never imagined that private gold ownership would be restricted. It still happened. Courts at that time upheld many of the measures. They ruled that in an extraordinary crisis, the needs of the state could override certain property expectations. That legal memory still echoes in modern emergency law. At the same time, there are powerful forces pushing in the opposite direction. The United States remains deeply tied to global capital flows. Its influence depends on foreign buyers trusting its rules. If Washington were seen as arbitrarily stripping savers or rewriting contracts in a way that scared investors worldwide, the political and economic cost would be high. Leaders must balance desperation against reputation. That is why any future move, if it ever occurs, would likely be framed as fair, temporary, and necessary rather than openly punitive. This balance is what makes the current moment so tense. Debt is high. Technology allows control at a level never seen before. Legal frameworks are broad, but global trust is also fragile. Every move sends shockwaves far beyond U.S. borders. For the individual viewer, this can all feel overwhelming. You watch the debt clock climb. You hear talk of digital currency, bank rules, gold reserves, and emergency acts. It sounds like a giant chessboard where every piece is moving at once. The truth is that even many experts do not know how this story will end. They only know the pressures that shape it. What is clear is that the age of simple money is over. The idea that savings sits safely outside politics has always been more hope than reality. Money is a social contract enforced by law. When that law changes, the contract changes with it. Some people respond to this by trying to predict exact dates and prices. They look for a single trigger that will flip the system overnight. History rarely works that cleanly. Large changes usually come through a series of steps. Each step is justified as limited and cautious. Only later do people see the full shape of the path. Others respond by ignoring the entire issue. They focus on daily life, work, family, and investments as usual. That approach also has logic. You cannot live in constant fear of every possible policy shift. Most worst-case scenarios never arrive. Between these two extremes lies a calmer position. You can acknowledge that long-term debt and powerful technology create real pressure on the system. You can accept that emergency powers exist and have been used before. You can also accept that predictions of total collapse are uncertain and often exaggerated. From that position, the question is not how to escape all risk. That is impossible. The question is how to understand which risks are structural and which are noise. Structural risks come from law, debt, and technology. Noise comes from social media, rumors, and wild price targets with no evidence. By learning the real history of how gold was used in the past, by learning how modern banking rules have changed its role, and by learning how digital systems allow new forms of control, you place yourself in a better position to judge future headlines. Instead of reacting to every dramatic claim, you can ask calmer questions. What law would make this possible? What incentive would drive it? What cost would it impose? Who would likely support it? Who would resist it? In the next part, we will look more closely at how a so-called windfall tax could realistically be used in a future crisis and how past governments have used similar tools without calling it confiscation. That part is where the financial logic of quiet wealth transfer becomes very clear. To understand how a government can take wealth without physically taking the asset, you have to understand how taxes can be used as a quiet tool of control. Most people think of taxes as something that happens once a year when they file a return. But in reality, taxes are a set of rules that can be redesigned at any time. When those rules change during a crisis, the impact can be sudden and powerful. A windfall tax is one of the most effective tools in this category. The idea behind it is simple. When an asset or an industry earns profits that are seen as coming from crisis conditions rather than normal business, the government claims a larger share of those profits. The argument is usually framed in moral terms. Lawmakers say that no one should get extremely rich from public suffering or national emergencies. The most famous modern U.S. example came during the energy crisis of the 1970s. Oil prices rose sharply due to global supply shocks and political conflict in the Middle East. As prices rose, oil companies made far more money per barrel than they had before. In response, Congress created a special tax on these profits. They did not seize oil fields or take over companies. They simply defined a base price and then taxed the extra profit above that level at much higher rates. This policy did not require any soldiers or force. It worked through accounting and reporting. Companies still owned their wells. They still sold their oil. Customers still paid at the pump. But a large portion of the extra profit was redirected to the government. From the outside, the companies appeared unchanged. On the inside, their reward from rising prices was sharply reduced. Now, think about how this same structure could be applied to assets instead of industries. Imagine a future moment when financial markets are under severe stress. The dollar is weak. Bond yields are rising. Inflation is high. At the same time, gold, silver, and some digital assets are climbing fast in price because people are seeking safety. In that environment, political pressure would build quickly. News commentators would ask why some people are getting rich while millions struggle with higher prices. Lawmakers would ask whether these gains are fair. The language of emergency would return. Words like fairness, stability, and shared sacrifice would dominate the debate. A bill could be introduced that defines a special tax on what it calls crisis gains. The law would likely set a base price for gold and other assets using some historical average. Any profit above that base, earned during the declared emergency period, would be taxed at a higher rate than normal capital gains. The tax might be presented as temporary and targeted. It would be marketed as a way to fund relief programs and stabilize the economy. From a legal perspective, this is fully within the power of Congress. The Constitution allows Congress to tax income. Courts have long ruled that capital gains count as income. Congress already sets different rates for short-term and long-term gains. Creating a special category during an emergency would be controversial, but not automatically illegal. The key difference between a normal capital gains tax and a crisis windfall tax is not ownership. It is timing and scale. You still hold the asset. You still sell it when you choose to. But the share of the profit you keep can change overnight with a new law. What looked like a life-changing gain on paper can shrink dramatically after tax. Consider a simple example. Suppose someone bought gold at $2,000 per ounce. During a future crisis, the market price rises to $10,000 per ounce. On the surface, that looks like an $8,000 gain per ounce. Under today's normal long-term capital gains rules, a significant but limited portion of that would go to taxes, and the rest would stay with the owner. Under a windfall-style rule, the government might say that only the first part of that rise counts as a normal gain. Everything above a set crisis threshold will be taxed at a much higher rate. The owner still technically benefits, but the scale of the benefit is heavily reduced. From the government's point of view, this approach has several advantages. It raises large sums of money quickly without borrowing. It targets a politically unpopular group in times of stress. It avoids the optics of direct seizure. It can be reversed later when the crisis is declared over. From the saver's point of view, it feels very different. The entire reason many people buy gold or alternative assets is to protect the purchasing power of their savings in extreme conditions. A windfall tax strikes directly at that protection. It does not matter that the price rises if most of the rise is taken away at the moment of conversion. This is why some analysts describe such taxes as a form of soft confiscation. The metal remains in your hands. The legal title is unchanged. But the economic function of the asset as a hedge is damaged. The profit that was meant to offset inflation and currency loss is redirected to the state. Supporters of this approach would argue that extreme situations require shared burden. They would say that if the nation is under economic attack, those who gain from the breakdown of the currency should contribute more to the recovery. Opponents would argue that this punishes prudence and rewards debt and spending. Both sides would likely accuse the other of greed or irresponsibility. In the real world, tax policy is always shaped by political power. Large voting blocs matter. If most voters do not own gold or digital assets, they may not strongly oppose a special tax on them. If the media frames the issue as rich speculators versus struggling households, public opinion can be guided in a particular direction. This is not speculation without precedent. After major wars and depressions, many governments have imposed special taxes on wealth, assets, and profits. These are often sold as emergency measures and later become part of normal law in modified form. Now add modern technology to this picture. In the past, enforcing complex taxes required paperwork, audits, and years of legal disputes. Today, much of this can be automated. If asset sales are processed through regulated platforms, and if identity is linked to every account, then calculation and collection can happen instantly. If a future digital dollar is introduced as the main settlement currency for large transactions and taxes, enforcement becomes even tighter. The payment itself can be coded to perform the tax calculation. When you receive the proceeds of a sale, the system can automatically send the tax portion to the treasury before the rest reaches your wallet. There is no delay. There is no negotiation. The law is embedded into the money. For most people, the idea that code could collect tax in real time sounds efficient. For critics, it sounds like the final removal of distance between the state and individual wealth. There is no longer a space between earning and taxation. The gate sits directly on the path. This also changes how risk is perceived. In the old model, someone might try to delay selling an asset to postpone tax. In a coded settlement model, that delay only works until the moment of sale. The rules apply instantly when liquidity is created. It is important to stress that none of this proves that such a plan will definitely be used. It only shows that the tools already exist and have historical roots. The combination of high debt, emergency laws, tax authority, and digital settlement creates possibilities that did not exist in earlier generations. For the average citizen, this raises a hard question. If you cannot count on selling an asset at full market value in a crisis because of emergency taxes, how do you measure real wealth? Is it the number printed on the screen? Or is it the purchasing power that remains after law and policy have taken their share? This is one reason why some people believe that holding assets solely for price appreciation during a crisis may not be enough. They argue that the ability to use that asset without passing through a tax gate becomes just as important as the asset itself. Whether that belief proves accurate depends entirely on how future laws are written and enforced. Another side of this discussion involves retirement savings and pension funds. These pools of money are deeply tied to government policy. Many pensions and funds hold large amounts of government bonds. If bond values fall due to inflation or currency weakness, the pressure on these systems rises. In that environment, governments look for new revenue sources that do not immediately hit wages or consumption. Special asset taxes become attractive in that context. They target capital instead of labor. They can be framed as fairer during emergencies. They can be directed toward programs that protect retirees, banks, or essential services. Again, the logic from the state's point of view is clear. The political cost is spread across a smaller group of people. Yet history also shows that once a special tax category is created, it rarely disappears completely. It may shrink. It may be renamed. But the principle that crises justify exceptions tends to survive. Each generation inherits not only infrastructure and debt, but also emergency powers built by earlier ones. This cumulative effect is what worries long-term thinkers. A single law may seem reasonable in isolation. A pattern of laws across decades builds a permanent emergency state in financial policy. What begins as a temporary fix can become normal practice. When you place gold, digital assets, and alternative stores of value into this picture, their role changes. They are no longer just investments. They become political objects. They sit at the intersection of private choice and public need. The more important they become as shelters from currency risk, the more attention they attract from policymakers seeking to manage that risk. This does not mean that every rise in gold or digital prices will trigger new taxes. It does mean that in times of extreme national stress, policy imagination expands. Ideas that seemed unthinkable in calm years are suddenly described as responsible and necessary. The hardest part for ordinary savers is that these shifts often happen quickly. Markets react in minutes. Laws can move through Congress in days during emergencies. What felt like a stable long-term plan can change before a person has time to adjust. This is why historians often say that the most dangerous financial moments are not the slow declines, but the sudden rule changes. Prices can be volatile, but rules define the field. When the field itself is redrawn, the game changes completely. For a long time, many people assumed that advanced economies would never use blunt tools again. That only less developed states would impose capital controls, special wealth taxes, or forced conversions. Recent history has shown that this assumption was too confident. Even large democratic countries have imposed strict controls during crises when they believed no other option remained. The lesson from this is not that disaster is certain. The lesson is that financial rights are not as fixed as people often believe. They exist within a legal and political framework that can expand or contract under pressure. When debt is manageable and growth is steady, that framework feels almost invisible. When debt balloons and growth falters, the framework becomes very visible very fast. Whether a future administration under Trump or any other leader would choose such a path depends on many factors: public opinion, global conditions, court challenges, market reactions. No single person controls all of that. But the structural forces are real, and they shape the range of possible responses. For now, these ideas remain part of policy debates, academic papers, and investor discussions. They are not official U.S. policy. There is no current law imposing a windfall tax on gold ownership itself. There is no official plan to force conversion at extreme tax rates. These are scenarios that flow from existing powers and past precedents, not from announced programs. Understanding the difference between what is possible and what is planned is critical. It prevents panic, but it also prevents blindness. It allows people to think in terms of probabilities rather than certainties. In the next part, the focus will shift from taxation to market mechanics. We will look at what could happen inside the gold and paper markets during extreme stress and why many analysts believe physical supply, paper contracts, and settlement rules could diverge sharply in a true crisis. To understand what could really happen in a severe financial crisis, you have to look closely at how the gold market actually works. Most people imagine a simple world where buyers meet sellers and bars of gold change hands. In reality, the modern gold market is divided into two very different layers. One is the physical market where real metal is stored, moved, insured, and delivered. The other is the paper market where price exposure is traded through contracts and exchange products. The paper market is many times larger than the physical market. Every day, huge amounts of so-called gold change hands on screens without a single bar moving anywhere. Banks, hedge funds, and traders buy and sell futures and other contracts based only on price movement. Most of these contracts are never meant to end in physical delivery. They are simply bets on direction. As long as trust in the system holds, this works smoothly. Traders close their positions before delivery. Exchanges keep enough metal in reserve to handle the small number of contracts that do go to delivery. Everyone assumes the paper claim is as good as metal because it can be settled in cash at a fair market price. The stress appears when too many people want the same thing at the same time. If fear spreads and owners of paper gold begin demanding physical delivery instead of cash settlement, the imbalance becomes visible. The exchange must then either find enough metal to honor those demands or change the rules of settlement. In most contract rulebooks, the exchange is allowed to declare extraordinary conditions. These can include supply breakdowns, transport failures, or threats to the functioning of the market. Under such conditions, the exchange can settle outstanding contracts in cash instead of metal. This means a trader expecting a bar of gold instead receives dollars based on a reference price chosen by the exchange. From the point of view of the exchange, this keeps the market from collapsing. From the point of view of the investor who expected metal, it can feel like the ground has shifted under their feet. They do not get what they planned for at the moment when it matters most. In normal times, this difference does not matter much. The cash price and the physical price move close together. In a crisis, the gap can widen sharply. Physical gold can become scarce. Premiums can rise far above official prices. At the same time, paper prices can be frozen, delayed, or settled at levels that no longer reflect real-world supply and demand. This is why some analysts distinguish between the gold price and the gold market. The number on a screen is only meaningful as long as physical supply is flowing normally and contracts are honored in metal. When those links weaken, the visible price can lose its connection to real purchasing power. A similar pattern has appeared in smaller form in past commodity shortages. When energy markets tighten or when food supplies are disrupted, futures prices and local spot prices can separate. Those who depend on physical delivery feel the shortage first. Those who only hold paper claims feel it later, if at all. In a deep enough financial shock, this separation can become permanent for a time. Governments may step in to stabilize exchanges. They may restrict deliveries. They may cap prices. They may encourage cash settlement to prevent a cascade of defaults. From the government's perspective, this is often framed as protecting market order. From the individual saver's perspective, it can feel like the silent rewriting of a contract. This brings us to exchange-traded funds, often called ETFs. Many people buy gold through these products because they are easy to trade and fit neatly into retirement accounts. An ETF share is backed by gold held by a custodian. But the small investor cannot normally demand delivery of that gold. Only large authorized participants can do so, and even then under strict conditions. In a severe crisis, if physical gold becomes extremely scarce and valuable, the rules of these funds matter more than their marketing. Most prospectuses make it clear that the fund can settle in cash under extreme circumstances. This protects the fund and its manager. It does not guarantee the outcome the retail holder imagines. This does not mean ETFs are unsafe in all conditions. It means they serve a different purpose from owning metal directly. They give price exposure within the financial system. They do not remove you from that system. During calm markets, that distinction is easy to ignore. During a breakdown, it becomes the central issue. Now widen the lens to include Bitcoin and other digital assets again. At first glance, these seem completely different from gold. There is no vault. There is no physical delivery. There is only code and consensus. Yet a similar dependency exists. To turn digital assets into spending money at scale, you usually need an exchange, a bank, and a payment network. Those are the bridges. If those bridges remain open, digital assets flow smoothly into the real economy. If those bridges are restricted in an emergency, the value of the asset becomes trapped inside the closed system. You may see a high price on a screen, but you cannot use it where you need to. In recent years, regulators have spent a great deal of effort making sure that these bridges are within their reach. Identity checks, transaction reports, capital requirements, and licensing rules all serve that goal. In usual times, this protects consumers and reduces fraud. In a crisis, it also gives the state immediate leverage over conversion. This is where the idea of a financial perimeter becomes useful. Inside the perimeter, all money moves under clear surveillance and taxation. Outside the perimeter, assets may exist, but their ability to interact with daily life shrinks. Food stores, fuel stations, hospitals, landlords, schools, and utility companies are all tied to the inside network. You can only operate there with accepted money. That does not mean people outside the perimeter instantly starve. Informal economies always exist. Barter always exists. But these systems are inefficient and fragile. They work for small communities and short periods. They struggle when millions of people attempt to rely on them at once. This reality gives the state a quiet but powerful form of control. It does not need to seize every asset. It only needs to define what kind of money is acceptable for key functions. Over time, pressure does the rest. In past decades, such control required heavy use of force. Today, it can be achieved largely through regulation and technology. Nothing dramatic needs to appear on the evening news. The process can look boring, procedural, and technical. At the same time, resistance also evolves. Some people move assets into foreign jurisdictions. Some use private vaults. Some diversify into property, goods, or business ownership. Some simply accept the risk and continue as before. There is no single correct path because circumstances differ widely. What matters most is the understanding that liquidity is not the same as wealth. Liquidity is the ease with which an asset can be turned into accepted money. Wealth is the underlying value of what you own. In a crisis, liquidity is often rationed first. Gates appear. Delays grow. Conditions are added. The asset itself may still exist, but your ability to use it shrinks. Governments are always more focused on controlling liquidity than on counting private wealth. They can tolerate people owning many kinds of property. They become concerned when large volumes of value move quickly in ways they cannot track, tax, or manage. This core truth connects gold, paper markets, digital assets, and emergency law into a single picture. The common theme is not metal or code, it is the control of flow. When debt is low and confidence is high, flow is encouraged. When debt is high and confidence begins to crack, flow is restricted. The pipes that were once wide begin to narrow. The reason given is always stability. For many decades, the United States benefited from being at the center of global finance. Capital flowed in freely. The dollar served as the main medium of international trade. This allowed the country to borrow at low cost and run large deficits without immediate punishment. That privilege still exists, but it is not infinite. As the debt grows and as rival powers build alternative payment systems, pressure on that privilege increases. In response, the system looks for ways to defend itself. Some of those ways involve interest rates, some involve trade policy, some involve digital infrastructure, some involve emergency powers. None of these tools on their own determine the outcome. Together, they shape the space in which future decisions will be made. The more tight that space becomes, the fewer gentle choices remain. For an individual watching this from the outside, it can feel like standing on shore as dark clouds build over the ocean. You do not know exactly where the storm will hit or how violent it will be. You only see that the weather is changing. The danger of the moment is not only in what might happen, but in the false sense of certainty on both sides. Some voices promise total collapse and guaranteed confiscation. Others promise perfect safety and endless stability. History supports neither extreme. What history does show is that large debt cycles nearly always end with some form of reset. That reset can take many shapes. Inflation, currency adjustment, tax changes, financial repression, sometimes a mix of all of them. Rarely does it look clean or fair when seen up close. During such transitions, those with flexible thinking, diversified exposure, and legal awareness usually fare better than those who assume yesterday's rules will hold forever. This is not about secret tricks or dramatic escapes. It is about understanding where force and where freedom realistically lie in a modern state. The paper market, digital networks, and tax systems all sit inside the reach of law. Physical assets in foreign jurisdictions sit at the edge of that reach. None sit fully outside it. The boundary between inside and outside shifts with policy. This is the tension that defines the coming years. Not a sudden collapse into chaos, but a gradual tightening of official channels and a gradual adjustment of how people think about ownership, privacy, and control. Some will see this as necessary modernization. Some will see it as a loss of autonomy. Both views can exist at the same time. What matters is that the environment in which savings live is not purely economic. It is political, legal, and technological all at once. In the next and final part, we will bring all of these threads together. We will look at what history suggests about who tends to gain and who tends to lose during major monetary resets, and what practical lessons can be drawn without falling into fear or fantasy. When people look back at every major money reset in history, one pattern appears again and again. The reset never feels fair in the moment. It always feels confusing. It always feels rushed. And most people only fully understand what happened years later, when the damage and the winners are already clear. The rules change first. The explanations come later. In every reset, some people lose purchasing power without ever seeing an official notice that their wealth was taken. Their savings still exist in name, but what those savings can buy shrinks. They are not robbed in a visible way. They are adjusted out of the system quietly. Others see new opportunities appear almost overnight. Assets that once seemed dull become the center of attention. Businesses that were buried in debt find relief. Institutions that were near failure recover through accounting changes rather than fresh productivity. This is why monetary resets are rarely described as confiscations in official language. They are described as reforms, stabilizations, modernizations, or emergency measures. The words sound calm. The experience for ordinary people often does not. History shows that during these periods, the middle class tends to feel the most pressure. The very rich usually have access to lawyers, structure, and multiple jurisdictions. The very poor are often protected by aid programs and subsidies. The middle group holds most of its wealth in local currency, pensions, home equity, and savings accounts. These are the categories that are easiest to adjust through inflation, taxation, or rule changes. This does not mean that every person in the middle loses everything. It means that relative position often shifts. Someone who felt secure before the reset may feel stretched afterward. Someone who felt stretched before may feel invisible afterward. The system does not collapse evenly, it tilts. Another lesson from history is that fear itself becomes a powerful economic force. When people believe that rules might change, they rush to move money, sell assets, or hide savings. These rushes can make stress far worse. Banks become unstable not only because of bad loans, but because people pull deposits at the same time. Markets fall not only because of poor earnings, but because everyone tries to exit together. Sometimes the fear of confiscation causes more damage than any actual policy. This is why calm analysis is more valuable than dramatic prediction. No one can say with certainty what a future administration under Trump or any other leader will choose to do. The debt problem is real. The legal tools are real. The technology is real, but politics is also real. Courts exist. Opposition exists. Markets react. Foreign governments respond. Each move carries costs as well as benefits. Governments do not enjoy destroying trust in their own currency. Trust is the foundation of tax collection, borrowing, and international power. Once trust is deeply damaged, it takes many years to rebuild. Leaders know this. That knowledge acts as both a brake and a bargaining chip in every internal debate. At the same time, debt creates its own form of pressure. When interest costs grow faster than tax revenue, when borrowing becomes more expensive, when voters resist spending cuts but demand services, the range of painless choices narrows. At that point, leaders begin to look for solutions that spread pain in ways that are less visible and less immediate. This is how monetary policy and fiscal policy quietly blend together. Inflation becomes a silent tax. Emergency levies become fairness measures. Asset rules become stability tools. None of these are introduced with the language of loss. They are introduced with the language of rescue. For individuals trying to make sense of this environment, the most important shift is mental. It is the acceptance that money is not just a number in a bank account. It is part of a legal system. It is part of a political system. It is part of a technological system. When any one of those systems changes, meaning of that number can change as well. This does not mean that saving is pointless. It means that saving without understanding context carries hidden risk. The safest feeling is often the most dangerous one. True safety is uncomfortable because it requires ongoing attention. Some people respond to these ideas by trying to predict exact outcomes. They search for a single date when the reset will occur. They look for a specific gold price, a specific policy announcement, a specific executive order. History suggests that resets rarely arrive on a clean schedule. They usually unfold in stages, a rule change here, a new tax there, a technical regulation that only specialists notice. Later, people realize those small steps formed a larger pattern. Others respond by doing nothing at all. They decide that worrying is pointless and that they will simply deal with whatever comes. That attitude also has a certain logic. Most people must live their daily lives regardless of what governments and markets may do. Constant fear is not a strategy. Between panic and denial lies preparation. Preparation is not about hiding in bunkers or chasing every rumor. It is about understanding exposure. It is about knowing which parts of your life depend directly on the stability of one system and which parts are more flexible. It is about legal awareness rather than secret tricks. One of the quiet lessons of every monetary reset is that flexibility outperforms rigidity. People who can adapt, who can adjust plans, who can operate across more than one structure tend to recover faster than those who rely on a single promise. Another lesson is that ownership is not only about possession, it is also about access. You may own an asset, but if law or technology restricts how you access or convert it during stress, your practical control over that asset is limited. Real control exists where possession, legal recognition, and liquidity overlap. There is also a timing lesson. In every reset, the greatest opportunities appear not at the height of fear, but after the initial shock when prices have adjusted and the new rules are clear. Many people exhaust themselves trying to outrun the storm. The ones who rebuild calmly after often do just as well or better. This does not make the transition painless. It only makes it survivable for those who remain clear-headed. It is also worth remembering that not every debt cycle ends in disaster. Some end in slow adjustment, years of moderate inflation, political compromise, and gradual reform. These endings do not make dramatic headlines. They simply feel like a long period when money buys a little less each year and taxes creep up quietly. That path can be just as real as any sharp reset. Because of this, the most honest conclusion is not that gold will be confiscated or that a digital currency will take over everything, or that a single leader will trigger a historical break. The honest conclusion is that the system is under visible strain, and strained systems behave in ways that surprise people who expect calm continuity. What happened in 1933 shocked the public because it defied what they thought was permanent. What surprised people in later decades was not that policy changed, but how quickly it did when pressure became great enough. That is the real lesson that carries forward. When you strip away the fear language and the dramatic claims, the core question remains simple. How much trust should any one person place in any one monetary structure? History's answer is always the same. Less than total. Trust is necessary. Without it, trade stops and society freezes. Blind trust, however, has always carried a price. The price is usually paid during periods of transition. As the United States moves deeper into the era of high debt, digital finance, and global competition, the relationship between citizens and the monetary system will continue to evolve. Some parts of that evolution will improve efficiency and access. Other parts will increase control and surveillance. Both trends can grow at the same time. The challenge for individuals is not to escape that evolution, which is impossible, but to move through it with awareness rather than illusion. Awareness does not guarantee safety. It does reduce shock. If a future crisis leads to major changes in how assets are taxed, settled, or valued, those changes will almost certainly be presented as necessary for stability. They will be debated. They will face resistance. Some will be delayed or softened. Others will pass. By the time the full effect is felt, the conversation will already have moved on to the next problem. This is how history usually moves. Not by sudden apocalypse, but by layered adjustment. The question each person quietly answers through their decisions is not whether they can stop that movement. It is whether they understand the direction in which they are being carried. Money, in the end, is not just a store of value. It is a measure of trust between people and institutions. When trust shifts, money shifts with it. The 1933 generation learned that lesson the hard way. Future generations will likely learn new versions of the same lesson in forms that fit their own time and technology. Whether the coming years bring sharp resets or slow erosion, the underlying truth remains unchanged. Wealth is never completely separate from power. It sits beside it, shaped by it, and sometimes taken by it. The goal is not perfect security. That has never existed. The goal is to see clearly enough to choose where you stand when the ground begins to move. History is unforgiving to those who assume the rules will never change. It is kinder to those who expect change, even when they cannot predict its exact form. And in times like these, when debt is high, technology is powerful, and trust is under strain, expecting change is not fear. It is simply realism.